Welcome to How to Sell More. On today's episode, I am sharing with you my top 3 lessons about startup, about go-to-market strategies, about launches that I learned from the Beatles. Yes, the Beatles, of course, the number one group of all time. No one did what they did before them. No one has come close to doing what they did after them. They are truly one of a kind. Now, if you're not into the Beatles, or you don't really care that much about their music, or you think they're overhyped, or you're not quite sure why everyone goes on about them all the time, don't worry, there are still lessons that you can learn in this episode. But if you're like me, someone who's a huge fan of music history, who loves to figure out why leaders, why they think what they think, why they did what they did, the lessons that they learned the hard way, so that way I don't have to do it. There's so much we can learn from them. And so personally, I have spent far too long learning about music history and about the Beatles and about what was happening at the time in culture, what was happening behind the scenes, what did RCA, the music record company, and what did Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles before he passed away, and frankly, what did the producers think? Like, what was everyone's part in it? And as I learned more and more, I came to realize, this version of history that I thought existed, the way that, growing up in the 90s and being, a Canadian in his 40s today, it's always been there. The Beatles have always been there. Music has always been there. Rock and roll has always been there. And so sometimes I forget that everything had a starting point. And as I think the good book says, that every tree, starts as an acorn, as a seed, that every amazing thing today, everything that's lasting, everything that's really, really impactful started as an idea, started as a very small thing. And the Beatles are not unlike what you're launching, not unlike your go-to-market strategies, not unlike the startup that you may be working on. And so I'm going to share with you the 3 lessons I've learned from them, because not only will they surprise you and hopefully entertain you a bit, but the lessons that they put into place in the early 60s still applies today. So with that, I am Mark Drager. Let's get into it. So of course, when I said the Beatles, you probably start humming, maybe your favorite tune. What is it? Maybe it's like, Here Comes the Sun, which was written by George Harrison and actually kept off a bunch of records. It was on the Abbey Road record, the last record they ever recorded. And at the time was not even a huge hit, but has become one of their number 1 stream songs of all time. Or maybe you like, Hey Jude. Maybe you're a big fan of Sgt. Pepper's. Maybe you love their early work. But today, when we look back at the Beatles, here's what we know. Paul McCartney, the bass player, and arguably, really frankly, the leader, the man, the ambitious man who pushed the Beatles to record album after album, tour, always stay on top, always be on the cutting edge, always push the sound. He's gone on in his career across the Beatles and Wings and as a solo artist to write and release 32 number 1 Billboard songs. The number 1 artist with the most number 1 hits of all time is Paul McCartney. Tied for second place with Max Martin, a current producer, is John Lennon. They both have 26 number 1 hits. And so if we ignore Max Martin, who's had his own career for the last 20 or 30 years as a songwriter, but if we just look at Paul McCartney and John Lennon, yes, this covers the Beatles and it covers solo albums as well. But between the two of them, 58 number 1 hits. 58. And of course, when the Beatles broke out in the US, because they really struggled to leave the UK and go to the US, their record label kept holding off. The US version of the record label did not want to release them. But when they finally broke in whatever it was 63 in the US, they had 5 number 1 hits at the same time. They held number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the Billboard 100 charts. In fact, there are times where I was reading a biography about the Beach Boys, and the only reason why the Beach Boys, one of their songs only hit top 6 on the charts is because they could not get any higher. There was no room. They had 1 through 5. And yet when I look back at who the Beatles were in 1960 and 61 and 62 and 63, before they really became the Beatles, I think you'd be surprised to find out that they were ambitious. They were an ambitious bunch of guys. And it seems like they got a lot of stuff lucky and the timing may have been right. But they made some major mistakes along the way. And at the same time, the team around them made some really smart moves to help propel them to the top. And with your startup, with your go-to-market strategy, with whatever it is you're aiming to launch, there are 3 things that we can implement today to help us get to the next level, to break through the noise, to get the awareness, to get more people to know, like, and trust us, to generate more leads, all the stuff that we want to do to be able to have a successful brand, successful marketing, and sell more starts with these 3 things. So lesson number 1 is do not expect to get it right when you launch, and do not wait for things to be perfect. Perfectionism and being very, very, very calculated and being very, very careful and being risk adverse and waiting for everything to get perfect and make sure that every T is crossed and every I is dotted and everything is sanitized to the point where we're not going to offend anyone, and we're going to be really careful, and we're going to make sure that this has to work. This has to work 100%. We can't have any failures. We need to make sure we get it right. Well, the Beatles didn't do that. And frankly, I don't think I've seen a successful company who actually launched anything that was successful that way. No. In fact, what we need to do is we cannot wait until we are ready. We need to go to market with something. And so, as a bunch of young guys in 1960, as a bunch of teenagers, these guys get together, they meet. John Lennon is one of the older kids. Paul McCartney is I think 2 years younger. George Harrison's even younger than that. So these are some teenage boys who get together. But when they get together, let's just talk about who the Beatles really were. Well, they were the Quarrymen. That was the name of their first group. And then the Quarrymen become the Beatles. And then the Beatles become the Silver Beatles. And they audition to be a background group for Billy Fury. Now, this is May of 1960. So in May of 1960, they go from the Quarrymen to the Beatles. And then 10 days later, the Beatles become the Silver Beatles. And then 2 weeks later, the Silver Beatles are busy touring Scotland. And every member of the group has a fake stage name. So we got Long John, that was Lennon. We got Paul Ramon, who's McCartney. We've got Carl Harrison, who's George. And then many people don't realize that Ringo Starr joined the group much, much later. But we got Studi Stahl, that's Stuart Stutkuff. And then Tommy Moore is using his real name. He's playing the drums. So that's the end of May. Well, just a few days later, the Silver Beatles become the Beatles before reverting to the Silver Beatles again. And then in July, the Silver Beatles become the Silver Beatles. And I keep saying this, and you keep thinking like he keeps saying the Silver Beatles. They kept changing the name of how it's spelled. In August, Pete Jest joins the Silver Beatles as their drummer. And then finally in August, the group becomes the Beatles before they set off to Hamburg, Germany, where they did all of these tours. They would play in these clubs like 8, 10, 12 hours a day after day after day. They would do it for like 2, 3, 4 week stints. And really, that was how they were able to connect, to practice. Being forced to play 8, 10, 12 hours a day, songs over and over and over again in live clubs in Germany, of all places, really helped them perform their stagecraft and helped give them some attitude. But just look at that. Just look at that one fact that they changed their name time and time and time again. Now, it doesn't cost them anything to change the name. It doesn't even really matter because, frankly, they're not signed yet. They're not well known. No one knows who they are. But let's just imagine if they waited for everything to be perfect. If they didn't sign up for the tour in Hamburg, if they didn't start playing stages, if they didn't do stuff because they're like, we need to do a really detailed report on how we get this name corrected. Or what about the fact that the group had, a few members in it, and then they were replacing drummers, which is pretty common for most groups. Now, during this time, of course, they're a bunch of young guys, they're in Germany, but here's how it goes for October, November, kind of December of 1960. Well, November 10th, John leaves Hamburg, Germany, because he has to. George is deported from West Germany for being underage as a worker in nightclubs because he was still a young teenager. Paul and Pete, a few days later, get thrown into jail for apparently setting a fire to their living quarters. And where are they living? Above a cinema, above a movie theater. And Paul and Pete get released from jail, but ultimately are deported from West Germany. Now Stu, right? Their new drummer, their brand new drummer, he decides to stay in Germany with his girlfriend. And so now they just lost their drummer. And so that is just a few months in 1960 before the Beatles are the Beatles. Now, I take a lot of comfort in reading these kind of stories because often I feel, with my own work, with our clients, with the way that, what we say, the way that entrepreneurship and the way corporate works today, there feels a need or pressure to make sure that you always get it right every single time, right out of the gate. Maybe your clients, maybe your managers, maybe your executives will not be satisfied with failure. You have to get it right, and you have to get it right every time, and you have to get it right away. Now, of course, that is not how sales works. That's not how marketing works. That's not how life works. We need to pick something. We need to be smart about it, right? Do some cost-benefit analysis, look at risk, do some market research, talk to your customers, find a need. You don't want to be pouring millions or hundreds of thousands or tens of millions of dollars into something that might not work. But we know that there's no set it and forget it. In branding, in marketing, in sales, in customer experience, there is no set it and forget it. It is assumed that we will have a growth mentality. It is assumed that we will learn things. It's assumed we're going to get better, that we're going to make iterative improvements, and we're going to be able to find our way. And so lesson number one, whenever we're in startup or whenever we're in launch mode, it's not to wait for things to be perfect. It's just to start. And it's to make very quick changes as you need to, as you move through that season, that period of time. Now, let's flash forward to 1961. So all of that stuff with being deported was right before Christmas of 1960. Let's go to the fall, a year later, of 1961. So this is a whole year later. And this is a really important time for the Beatles because this is when they met their manager, Brian Epstein. Now, Brian was just a few years older than them. They were teenagers and he was in his mid to late 20s, and he owned a record shop. Now, he heard about this group making the rounds, and at the time, I guess there weren't the A&R people, the people who go out and find these groups and bring them to record labels quite as much as there have been in the 90s or maybe even today. But he heard about this group, and he went out to check them out, and here's what he found. He found a bunch of young guys, a bunch of rock and rollers, teenagers who really liked rockabilly, country, western, rock and roll, greaser style rock and roll. He found a bunch of yahoos up on the stage being inappropriate, greased back hair, leather, like just think of the early 60s, late 50s rock and roll, sugar in your hair, greased back type thing. Yeah, sugar in your hair, that's actually a thing. I asked my grandfather before there was hair gel, he used to put sugar water in his hair. Which, if you use the wrong stuff, apparently, because everyone smoked, you can sometimes light your hair on fire. And if you weren't careful, bees would chase you. But let's ignore that. So imagine these guys up on stage like a bunch of young, anti-authority, young rock and roll type guys. And here's what he sees. People who have talent, people who have ambition, people who are hardworking, but not someone he could market. Not someone he could sell, not someone that the general public in the UK would even give a second glance at. And if we go back to this time and period, we got to remember that one, there's no internet and there's very little television, especially in the UK. In the US, there's 3 channels. There's NBC, CBS, and ABC. And so there was a very controlled media. But in the UK, especially on the radio, rock and roll music was not played. There was like a 1-hour period on Saturday afternoons. And I read about this in Phil Collins' biography when he talked about growing up and the impact that the Beatles had on him. But for quote unquote youth music, which is what rock and roll was, there was 1 hour on a Saturday afternoon. And then there was records. You can go to the record store. You can go get 45s. You can go buy stuff and you can collect your own music. But Epstein sees something in these guys and he signs them and they sign with him and he becomes their manager. And he actually becomes the 5th Beatle. He ends up getting 20%. They end up splitting all revenue across all 5 parties. And he stays with them up until his death, his early death when he's 31, 32, kind of in like 1966, 1967. And so there's this 5-year run, 6-year run where he is essentially the 5th Beatle. And here's what he does. And here's really the lesson for us. He says, how can I market this group. He starts to get them auditions, which they do not pass. He starts to get them meetings with record producers, and they will not produce their stuff. He starts pushing them to tour with people and to go out on these tours, and they're kind of okay. But again, if you go back to the early records of the Beatles, I mean, their first album was recorded in a single day. Their second album has a ton of covers in it. They were not songwriters. They were not really very good musicians. They had zero music theory and zero training, but there was something there. They were willing to work hard. They were willing to have fun, and they were willing to do whatever it took. And so Epstein goes to them and says, we have to repackage you. What you have is too rough around the edges that we cannot sell this in the market. We need to get you guys cleaned up. We need to get you guys in suits. We need to get you in ties. We need to make sure that that all of your hair matches, so that like moppy haircut that you can imagine them all having the same haircut. It was because most people were pretty clean cut, and they wanted to attract the young girls and they wanted to attract the youth, but they needed to show up in a way where they looked like pleasant young men, because otherwise they wouldn't get the auditions, they wouldn't get on BBC, they wouldn't get exposure, they wouldn't get producers. RCA and the other record labels would not take them seriously. And so Epstein kind of did a rebrand of them. And it's a really smart approach. It's an approach that we take, and it's an approach that most successful companies take, rather than just show up and say, this is who we are, this is what we do, which is what the Beatles could have done, right? Like, hey, we're greasers. No. They said, who do we need to become? How do we need to look? What do we need to say? How do we need to make people feel? Which is the very foundation of branding. And they do that because they have to start positioning their band to be able to, one, get the auditions, get more tours, get more stages, get a record label or producer to be willing to back their single, get it produced, get it out into market, and then impress people. And this takes us to lesson number 3, because they get the audition eventually. They get to play in the clubs. They eventually get a record producer to produce one hit for them, one song. And this first single is Love Me Do, and the B-side is P.S. I Love You. And it's released in the UK, October 5th, 1962. So where did we start this episode? We were talking about 1960. And then I was like, oh, yeah. And then the fall of 61, Epstein joins them. We're now in the fall of 62. And they have their first double A-side single going out, P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do. And in this time, their drummer passed away of a brain hemorrhage. They recruit Ringo Starr, and they bring him in. They do a ton of work to try and get a record label after being denied a whole bunch of things. But they have their single. They have it recorded. I've even heard rumors on the first recording that Ringo Starr got pulled out of the studio of recording because he wasn't a good enough drummer to be able to drum on the recordings. So these are not like, again, this is not the Beatles we've come to know and love, but they have their shot. And what do they need to do, right? So one, we got the stage time, we have the manager, we have the record label, we've been in studio, we now have our shot. But if this single doesn't do well, no one will know them, no one will pay attention to them, no one will ever give them a second shot. So what do? How does this little unknown band break through? Well, Brian Epstein, as I mentioned, owned a record store. It's rumored, it's suggested, it's said, and I'm pretty sure it's true, that he bought thousands and thousands of copies of the album and put them in a warehouse. Now, why did he do this? Well, is it pay to play? Is it like, what are you going to do? It's the way that a lot of New York Times bestselling books make the list these days. He knew that if he did not chart this single, it would not get a second chance. He had to chart this single. So he made sure it charted. He dug into his own pockets with his own money. He bought, something like 10,000 copies of the album or 15,000 copies of the album. He put them in a warehouse somewhere to just sit because he knew that the album would chart, the single would chart. And if the single would chart, then it would get more radio play. And if it got more radio play, because it's so catchy and so good, that he would be able to then get more exposure, which would then earn them the second recording to be able to have a full album, and it would kickstart things. And then once they're popular, and once things have been kickstarted, he can go and dig into that record collection because he has now thousands of copies of the same single, and he can go ahead and sell it on the market and claim back his money. And perhaps even, I don't know if this is true, but perhaps even earn a bit of a markup. So did he spend all of that money? Well, he more like invested it. He invested and he had some cash tied up in something for a bit of time before he could then resell it and offload it. But what a great and smart play, because that's in fact what happened. The single charted, it moved up the chart, it got more exposure, it proved that there's this youth culture that's hungry for this type of music. It impressed the people at the record labels and all of the people at the BBC and everyone they needed to, and it was the start of everything for them. Now, I can spend probably 4 or 5 hours just talking about this. There are so many lessons. There's lessons in terms of how they handled the press and how they were the most famous people in the world and how they put out 2 singles and 2 albums every single year, which is what produced so many hits. And there's just so many lessons you can learn from them. But when you are planning your next launch, if you are currently in startup, or you're creating a go-to-market strategy, I want you to think about these 3 lessons because they apply today. Number 1, do not wait to be perfect. Number 2, you have to create a brand that will actually sell. Not to anyone, but the people in power and the people who matter the most. You have to create your brand for them. And number 3, you have got to invest your time, your money, call in some favors, throw some resources. You have to do something to be able to kickstart that engine, that sales, that awareness, whatever it is. And too often, this is more for smaller companies, for solopreneurs, for startups, but I've even seen this in larger corporate clients. Too often, we think that if we just make it, if we just build it, people will come. Or if we just create the campaign, then that's enough. And frankly, you always have to do way more work selling than you think. You always have to do way more work in terms of creating compelling messages and creative. And it's so much harder to stand out and break out than you think. And frankly, it always costs so much more money than you hope. I'm not going to say than you think, but than you hope. And if there's anything we've learned from the Beatles, not waiting to be perfect, but just going and be willing to change as you learn stuff, making sure that you package yourself for the audience and for the targets, and finally putting your money where you need to put it most to be able to get that boost is how you launch a really great product. So that's my take. I would be interested to hear yours. Why not head over to LinkedIn, give me a search. My name is Mark Drager. I am the black and white photo with the blue background. Send me a DM and let me know what your takeaway was, or frankly, if you disagree with me, why? I want to thank you again for listening to How to Sell More, and I will catch you in the next episode.